They all told me about the hard times, but they said nothing about the miracles. Look, it's all good, no matter what you may do.
Okay.
There we go. All right, I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Jason Jackson. I was a B-1 Weapon Systems Officer. I was an aide de camp. I was a strategic planner in the Pentagon at the Headquarters Air Force, commander twice of Tactical Air Control Party units, and a war planner down at CENTCOM in MacDill Air Force Base.
All right. My name is Lieutenant Colonel retired Charlotte Jackson. I was a C-9 pilot and a C-130 pilot in the Air Force. Then I became an Air Force reservist and was an airlift execution and planning officer while in the reserves. And then I became a pilot for SkyWest, flew the CRJ 200, 700, and 900. And now I fly for Delta as a first officer on the 757 and 767. Okay. I needed a scholarship to get to college. I could not do it on my own, and applied for many, but I was very fortunate that I was able to qualify for an Air Force ROTC scholarship, and I actually got a 4-year specifically to nursing as an Air Force as a scholarship. But then my sophomore year of college, they allowed anybody to apply for pilot training, so I applied for pilot training, and that's how I became a pilot in the Air Force. So I have a degree in nursing, but I never used it.
My decision to join the Air Force, I was in high school. I always wanted to be a doctor when I was growing up. My great-grandfather was a doctor, so I was going to pursue that route. And then at one point in time, I was in junior ROTC, which is the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps in high school. And we were able to take a flight to Charleston Air Force Base in the C-141, which is now retired. Pilots gave me the opportunity to come up into the cockpit to do the night landing, to watch that. And that was the first time I'd ever seen an airplane land at night. And we rolled out on final, and I saw the runway lights light up at Charleston Air Force Base, and that was immediately when I realized I wanted to fly airplanes. So I decided I was going to change my career field. I did the same thing as Charlotte. I applied for a scholarship, was selected to go to Auburn University on an Air Force scholarship.
War Eagle.
War Eagle.
War Eagle.
And at that point in time, I never looked back and went through ROTC and joined the Air Force. No, I got that. No, that's good. So how did we meet? It would have been the fall of 1995. I was a freshman at Auburn University. Again, I was a cadet in the Reserve Officer Training Corps there, and
I was a sophomore.
She was a sophomore, a year ahead of me.
Big deal.
An upperclassman in the ROTC, which is a big deal for her. Because obviously I was a junior classman. And first time I saw her, I realized that she was a fruitcake. And
that's so nice.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
That's a good way to put it.
She was a ball of energy. Mm-hmm. And everybody loved Charlotte in ROTC because she was high energy, fun to be around, and was always outgoing. But admittedly, and she can jump in here at any point in time, because she was an upperclassman, she used to get in my face a lot and yell at me during training sessions.
He was not necessarily
good at things.
Well, yeah, you were a little rough around the edges, yeah. And he was kind of cute, so I decided to make sure that he succeeded. So we met in ROTC, and he bothered me enough, and then one day asked me out, and it's been downhill ever since.
23 years.
23 years.
Going on 24.
All right, so what is it like to be a flying couple? To have two Type A personalities, both aviation driven. We have our own opinions on things, and what's great is that when you have a story to tell, we can tell each other, and it's hilarious because we both get it. We have the same sixth sense of humor. I mean, we're pilots. But when our opinions differ, and you have two Type A's who it possibly causes a little conflict from time to time.
Yeah, so I'll add on to that. Charlotte and I, again, Type A personalities. We do really well together as a couple. We learned a long time ago that when we work on projects, though, it's best that somebody takes lead and the other one just leaves the room.
Yes.
It works the same way while we're flying.
It does.
Because we're both Air Force trained aviators. We're very critical of how the other one flies. It goes back to our early pilot and navigator training days where you give immediate feedback on what you're doing wrong while you're in the airplane. So it makes it entertaining to be a dual flying couple and trying to cross the country in an airplane.
Yes, entertaining.
In my opinion, what the Air Force is looking for candidates, whether it be a pilot or a navigator, combat systems officer, sensor operator, really just an officer in general, since that's kind of where we're focused on the flying world. First and foremost, they look for leadership capability. They want to be able to tell that an individual, from a young lieutenant all the way through the rest of his career, is going to be able to have the ability to lead the airmen that are beneath him. And that to be said, you don't have to come in as a lieutenant being the best leader. You're obviously going to be groomed over time, and the Air Force knows that. But they want to be able to see the potential from that. The other thing that they want to see, as far as aviation candidates in general, there's a lot of requirements which we can talk about later. But they want a bachelor's degree at a minimum to be an officer. You got to have a pretty decent GPA, and that fluctuates depending on the needs of the Air Force. Physically fit, and there's some very stringent requirements as far as the physical requirements, I guess, to say that the medical side of the stuff for vision, your heart, your ears, just really your all around physical makeup there. But I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
There are some height requirements and weight requirements because of the cockpit, but overall, if you're the average person or whatnot, you have to be able to pass a very stringent physical exam. But besides that, some of the bigger pictures as a candidate is just that bachelor's degree to start off with, and then the variables change every year from what the Air Force is looking for.
And I'll harp on the fact that people go, oh, bachelor's degree, then you have to have a 4.0 in physics. Well, to be an officer in the Air Force, you just have to have a bachelor's degree, honestly. And we always joke.
You could be in nursing.
Yeah, you could be in a nursing degree and go be a pilot. Or we always joke about having an underwater basket weaving degree, and as long as you have a degree, you could be an officer. And then the selection from there to go to a flight school, there are some other requirements. But
so what GPA and what, is there a degree that would be, what GPA and what degree would make you competitive?
So as far as the GPA itself, there's kind of a baseline that they're advertising right now in the Air Force, at least I've seen. It's about a 3.3.
3.0? Oh, 3.3.
Yeah, 3.3.
Okay, 3.3.
When I went through school, I knew folks that got selected for pilot training with a 2.8 or 2.9. Understandably, though, that they were in some of the tougher degrees, very hard engineering or physics.
But the degree doesn't necessarily matter. It really doesn't, whether you have a nursing degree or a physics degree or an aviation degree. When the Air Force is looking you as a candidate, it's the bachelor's degree, check.
Yeah. But if you want to, again, be competitive, you definitely want to have the highest GPA that you could possibly strive for. That's a really big box that they're really going to look to check. So if you come in with a 2.5 and you have another candidate that's a 3.8, well, there's a discriminator right there that they're going to go, well, this guy has a better GPA. So how do you become an Air Force navigator? There's a set of criteria that you're going to have to meet. And while you're in either ROTC, so the Reserve Officer Training Corps, or at the Air Force Academy, or you're going through Officer Training School, OTS, there are specific things that the Air Force really kind of wants you to be able to meet. And the first and foremost, particularly I'll talk about the ROTC side, because that's what I'm familiar with, having graduated at Auburn in that program. They look at your commander's recommendation first off. So the commander of your unit is going to rank all of the candidates for aviation based off of a series of things: leadership capabilities, your physical fitness capabilities, really kind of your GPA focuses into that too. And he's going to give a recommendation. And then beneath that becomes the GPA itself. And beneath that is a thing called an Air Force Officers Qualifying Test, AFOQT, which is very much like taking the SAT again. It's about a 4-hour test, if I recall. It's long.
I was exhausted.
And it focuses anywhere from verbal to math to spatial orientation questions, very aviation-related questions. There were some line diagrams that were absolutely
pictures.
just the worst thing possible to try to do. But based off of the score from your AFOQT, it'll break it down into certain segments, and they'll have a pilot segment, a navigator segment, and then they'll have, I think, a series of other things just beneath just a basic officer qualification. The higher you can score in the pilot or the navigator section also goes into the equation on whether or not you'd be selected. Particularly for the nav, the requirement is a little bit lower than it is for a pilot, but honestly not by much. So it just really becomes a competitive edge for this, what I'm going to talk about in college. You got to compete against your peers and try to be the best that you can be at it.
So the pros and cons of being a navigator versus a pilot, I think, and I'm not a navigator or was a navigator, however, a pilot in the Air Force, not everybody's that lucky. As a pilot, you have a direct translatable job into the civilian world, which is you become a pilot in the civilian world. However, as a navigator, there's not really any navigator jobs. I'll let you expand.
You hit the nail on the head. I can take a pilot from the Air Force who's had years of training in being a pilot and flying around the world and move him right into Delta or American or United. Pick a regional, it doesn't matter. I can take a navigator from the Air Force, and unfortunately, although you could have the same amount of hours as a pilot, the hours that you have are in the back seat of an airplane as aircrew, and it does not translate to the FAA. So you can come out with basically 0 ratings but have 3,000 navigator hours, and the FAA is going to shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, but do you have a commercial pilot rating, and do you meet the ATP minimums for pilots?
Will it make you a better pilot? I think that navigators are outstanding pilots because they understand all of the aviation concepts, but they can do crazy fast math in their brains because that's what they were doing before. But so it makes them excellent pilots when they become one, but they have to gain all those certifications, and then they have to build the hours.
So that's the con for me of being a navigator coming out of the Air Force is you can't really walk into an airline with a navigator rating. But the pro of being a navigator, in my opinion, because I got a lot of opportunities. You get to fly in some really, really cool airplanes, and you get to see the world. You fly all over the world and go to some places that most Americans will never, ever be able to see or even dream about going. So that's the pro of being a navigator. If you can't be a pilot, be a nav, go see the world.
So when it comes to becoming a fighter pilot versus a heavy pilot or a tanker pilot in the Air Force, I can give you perspective on when I went through pilot training. After you go through, so pilot training is divided into your T-37, which is the tweet, which is
T6s
now. I was going to say I was in T-37s. It's now T6s. Everybody flies the T6 for about 6 months, and then that's where you branch off, and you either go towards the T1s and the heavies, or you go to the T-38s and become a fighter pilot. And that you fill out your dream sheet and you put your wish list down, and it's all based on the needs of the Air Force. If the Air Force has a lot of fighter pilot openings, then you might have 25-50% of your class get fighters and 50 of your class get heavies. But other times there were only, I remember a little bit before my class, there were only 5 out of 30 were fighters. So it was a very small percentage. And that changes every year. Nobody has the crystal ball on that. So that percentage is completely driven. And then you are ranked 1 through 30 in your class. Number 1 will most likely, they will rack and stack you, and then number 1 gets his first choice, number 2, and it goes from there. So that's how it works in pilot training. So the percentage is completely based on the needs.
So I'll add to that story. While I was going through NAV school, I had an instructor who was a graduate of the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Program. We call it INJEPT in the Air Force, and it's in Shepherd Air Force Base at Wichita Falls. The individuals selected at the time to go to INJEPT were the best of the best coming out of Air Force Academy, ROTC, OTS. They were the best of the best. Pretty much guaranteed 95% or better selection to fighters. And their entire training syllabus was based off of flying with fighter pilots from the U.S. and all of our NATO allies. They had instructors here also. my instructor just happened to hit that point in time in the Air Force's needs where his entire class flew cargo or tankers. They all went #1 aviator out of college, Air Force Academy, does not matter. But the needs of the Air Force when they graduated said, sorry, there are no fighters. So lo and behold, they all wound up flying heavies. And there were some bitter individuals. But as Charlotte said, it becomes a mathematic requirement as the years go on. It's driven by money. It's driven by number of airplanes we have. We used to have more fighters 10 years ago than we do now. 20 years ago, we had a lot more fighters. So there were a lot more seats to fill from the pilot's perspective. So now I would say it's probably a little bit more difficult to pick up a fighter just because the requirements are less. But it's always hard to become a fighter pilot anyway because of the competitiveness of being #1, #2, #3 in your class and being able to select exactly what you wanted.
Now, the pros and the cons of being a fighter pilot, so those guys will fly sorties and they're like, I flew a .7 today, I flew a 1.1. Whereas we heavies are like, I just flew a 6.5 to Afghanistan. So there are pros and cons. Now, coming out of the Air Force, and I don't know from an HR perspective as far as, because a fighter guy is only going to have maybe 2,000 hours, whereas a heavy guy coming out might have 4,000 hours. And I do know that they take consideration into jet versus heavy. And I know that the military were able to change our equation just a little bit because we don't count taxi time. It's just flight time in our books. So we're able to add a .2 to each sortie to allow for taxi time, but that doesn't help the fighters that much. But it is considered when Delta's looking at a resume and they're like, this guy's only got 1,000 hours. Oh wait, he was an A-10 pilot versus this guy who's a C-17 and he has 3,000 hours. So that is taken into consideration.
Really, quite honest, I mean, just for your education, if you're a military trained pilot, it's easy to go to the airlines. Just don't be a douchebag when you go to the interview. Don't get a DUI.
So if you're a fighter pilot, if you manage to get, I just asked, if you are a fighter pilot versus a heavy, you can't go to the airlines.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
The fighter guys tend to have a little bit more requirements in learning how to work with another person in the cockpit because most of the time they're used to dealing with themselves. It's kind of like a Cessna 172 guy. He's used to doing
crew
everything.
Resource management.
And you're like, wait, there's two of us. You got to work together. So the fighter guys definitely have a little bit of learning of how to do that. But most guys are intelligent enough that they can figure it out.
Yeah.
Most.
And the airlines know. To that point, you have an individual who's a fighter pilot who flies single-seat airplanes for the most part at 500 plus knots, doing math astronomically fast, trying to do dogfighting or bombing runs or strafing runs, super complex missions. And the airlines know that individual, although he has less hours, is a very high-speed pilot and can handle himself in situations. So they're more than happy to take a fighter pilot any day.
But so when it comes to what is the likelihood of joining the Air Force and becoming a pilot, it goes back to the needs of the Air Force. It absolutely depends on what the Air Force needs at the time. I was very lucky. When I got my scholarship for nursing, I was actually not allowed to apply for pilot training because the Air Force needed nurses and doctors really badly. That's why I got my 4-year scholarship. But then my sophomore year of college, the number crunchers went, oh wait, we need a lot of pilots. And so I was able to apply for a pilot slot. I could be a nurse when I was fat, old, and ugly, but I couldn't be a pilot any day. So I went with that and I got it, and I'm so happy I did. But there are definitely, so you can get a pilot slot through ROTC, through the Air Force Academy, through the Air National Guard, through the United States Reserves, and OTS. Which is Officer Training School. So those are the 5 avenues. But when you go in, it's, again, all dependent on the needs of the Air Force. So we were actually talking about this the other day. If you hardcore are really wanting the pilot slot, the best way that we believe is to go through either the Guard or the Reserve, because when you apply for the Guard or Reserve and then you're picked up, they will oftentimes hire you with the intent of sending you to pilot training. And that's really the only way to control your fate.
Yeah, I would agree. And we were looking earlier today at just kind of the numbers. And if I recall, the Air Force currently has about 68,000 officers in the Air Force right now. And like I said earlier, to be an aviator, pilot or navigator or a CISO or any of the other seats in the airplane, navigator, stuff like that, EWO, you have to have a degree. And you have to have a degree to become an officer, so you got to be an officer to become an aviator. So there's only about 68,000 officers in the Air Force right now, and I calculated out there's about 18, almost 19,000 pilots. That's about 30% that are actual pilots in the Air Force. So round up, you could say it's about 1/3 of the Air Force officer corps are actual pilots. So it's not a bad, roll the dice. It's really not that bad. But again, needs of the Air Force. Before she got to college, the Air Force went through a lot of people referred to as it was a black period.
Dry spell.
It was the early 90s, and they may have taken 1 or 2 total people per graduating class of ROTC to go to pilot training because they didn't want them. They were actually trying to get rid of them. They were trying to push them out the door because the Air Force was overmanned at the time. That was based off of budget constraints that are placed on by administrations, Congress. Pick all the reasons on why your budget for the Air Force decreases. Well, it goes cyclically, so when the budget decreases, then the pilot requirements will start to decrease, as will everybody else in the Air Force. But there's always a bottom to that and an upswing. So it really boils down to timing. If you catch the timing curve right, so you got to be the right age. You have to be young enough. Unfortunately, for those people that hit 32 and they're trying to become a pilot next year, and the limit
33 is your limit.
The limit's 33. Then the door and the windows close on you, and you kind of miss your opportunity. But it does come in cycles, and 33% ish, 1/3, not bad.
Too shabby.
Not bad at all. The pros and cons of being in the Air Force, at least for me, flat out, I'll tell you the pro. I spent 20 plus years in the Air Force, retired, and I have made friends that will last a lifetime. People who, no matter what happens, they will always be there for you. Charlotte and I, we always laugh. We have a good friend currently that lives in San Antonio. I stay in touch with him. And he often jokes with his wife, who we've yet to meet, that this one time when I was getting ready to leave Dyess Air Force Base over in Abilene, I had nowhere to live. And I just moved in with the Jacksons for 3 months because that's what you do in the military. And it is. It's a small, tight-knit group of individuals who have shared experiences. And granted, we come from such a diverse background. And after day one of being around such a diverse group of people, you start to build all these bonds, and you realize that some of the stigmatisms that you have, or stereotypes that you have, or your views on pick any topic, will quickly go away because you're with people that you go, oh wow, I didn't realize people from New Jersey weren't like that, or pick any other stereotype you want.
Well, I think that having the common mission, no matter where you came from Georgia, boy, backwoods, or an Air Force
down in the
brat,
South,
or as I grew up, whatever your flavor is, you come together and you're all this dysfunctional group of morons, but you have one mission, and you're going to get that mission done no matter what, and that brings you together in ways that you never thought possible, and you are such a dysfunctional family, but you almost take pride in how just straight up weird you guys are, and it's awesome, and I do miss that. I was trying to think of the cons of the Air Force, and we don't have children, so that's one thing that does not necessarily tear us, because I know that being away from your family is difficult for a lot of people. Us being apart from each other is probably a good thing, and is the reason why we've been together for so long. It's like, isn't it time for a deployment or something for you? But no, we even deployments weren't bad for me. I brought all my little things to make it comfortable, and I set up my little nest, and I burrowed in the middle of the desert, and I worked out, I ate, and I slept, and I flew. Life was simple, so even deployments were not bad. Now, I didn't have some of the really nasty ones that some of our other friends had, but I was very fortunate, and I really, when I look back, I think one of the worst things about the Air Force was having to leave it. It was really tough.
Yeah, to add to that, and I got a little bit of a different view. I deployed several times in my career, and all of my deployments were fantastic. But one of the cons to that is no matter what happens during that deployment, you're either going to miss a birthday, or you're going to miss a wedding, or an anniversary, or a Christmas,
We
a
went
Thanksgiving.
5 years without an anniversary
We did.
together.
We did. So,
We just celebrate it later.
and for some people, you're going to miss the birth of your child, and that happens.
Yeah.
But for those of us who join the military with the understanding of, like Charlotte said, you got a mission to do, and you're going to do whatever it needs to take to get it done. Those are sacrifices that we were all willing to give up, because at the end of the day, there's a fulfillment of success and pride just serving your nation and fighting for the freedoms that all the Americans have, and then being able to come home and say, I can live in a free country because of what I just did. And
Very rewarding.
to Charlotte's point, the hardest thing about the Air Force, or at least the military in general, was leaving it. When it was time to go, it was time to go, and it was really tough. So, because you're leaving that core group of people that you have such a camaraderie with, that you're so used to being around, and as dysfunctional as we are,
So dysfunctional.
and as childish of humor as we have,
Third graders at top.
especially aviators, where poop jokes are probably
Just
the
say
funniest
fart
thing.
and somebody giggles.
It's all over from that point, as you can tell. She's already giggling. She's the one that said it. But when you leave that core group and you go back into the civilian world, and you start working at different places, and you realize, wow, I may work with a great group of people, but that camaraderie is not there, because there's not a shared experience necessarily that you've all gone through. So, okay.
So my favorite plane, hands down, is the C-130 Hercules. I love her. She's so chubby. She's cute. I just love her. She is the workhorse. She can do anything. We did airdrops. We landed on dirt runways. Night vision goggles, and fly anywhere, anytime. I think I was probably the most popular person when I arrived into Iraq or Afghanistan with a cargo full of toilet paper and mail. I think that I was pretty much a goddess at that point. But I loved being, so I flew C-130 E and H models, so the slicks, nothing fancy to her. We just got it done, whatever they needed moved. We could do air medical evacuation, which we did several missions of that as well. So she was my absolute favorite. You just put her where you wanted her.
So, for me, my favorite airplane, I'm a little biased also because I flew in the B-1. That would be my first answer, the B-1, and I'll come back to that. But I did get a chance to take a ride in F-16, so I will talk about that one first. I was very lucky. So I think I have about 1.1 hours in an F-16 in the backseat of a D model. And it was the coolest experience I've ever had. We can go supersonic in the B-1, but when the pilot in the F-16 said, let's see if we can break 300 knots before we get to the end of the runway, and we were well over 300 knots before we got to the end of the runway, and then we went straight vertical up to about 12,000 feet.
Nobody likes to show off.
It was it was the best time you could have with your clothes on, I can tell you that. So we went straight vertical, and about the time we reached vertical, he went, your aircraft. And I got to fly the airplane all the way up and through the overhead, which Air Force uses a term called coming up initial. So you fly over the top of the airfield and then you do a brake turn. So he let me fly up initial, do the brake turn to downwind, and he said, okay, my airplane, and he took it for landing. And that was the greatest thing I'd ever done in my life. Now, back to the favorite airplane, the B-1. It's a strategic bomber that can go around the world in about 24 hours, air refueled. It can carry a crap ton of bombs, about 48,000 pounds worth of bombs.
A lot.
It has 4 crew members on it, and you build a camaraderie when you're crewed together in combat like no other. And you really, really do a lot of really neat, cool missions helping out the guys on the ground who, when they get in a sticky point with the enemy, just being overhead and making
Close air
noise,
support.
close air support,
Yeah.
being overhead, making noise, dropping bombs, and making sure that the guys can make it out alive on the other end. by far, hands down, the best thing I've ever done.
But they don't carry toilet paper.
I think you're going to say it.
Okay, so civilian versus military flying. In the civilian world, it is all about smoothness. It is about passenger comfort, passenger perception, and let's not spill the gin and tonics in first class. So everything is about smoothness, and the military flying is you just get her done. So I was able to chop my throttles and put her into a bank and do whatever I wanted in the C-130. Now, when I flew the C-9, I was air medical evacuation, and we had sick people in the back. So again, that was smooth. But I thoroughly loved the military flying with the C-130. We may or may not have taken pride in making some of the Army boys throw up in the back during our penetration descents. May or may not have. But I do love there is so much more professional and courtesy within the civilian field that you didn't necessarily have in the military field, and that is nice. And I do appreciate that from day to day. But I did love my C-130 flying.
So I would say, comparing the civilian side to the military side, and this kind of goes to the training aspect of it. And again, purely my opinion. Hands down, I don't think you can get any better training, at least the training pipeline, than going through the military flight training. If you go to pilot training, go to Navigator training, it doesn't matter. From day one to the day you graduate and get your wings, it's extremely structured, extremely professional, very difficult, very challenging, and they're constantly putting you on your toes to see how you can handle situations.
Very disciplined.
So when you graduate and you come out as a fresh lieutenant with your pilot wings or your Navigator wings, and you go on to your next airplane, whether it's a C-130, an F-15, 16, B-1, doesn't matter, you're expected to show up to your next unit with a level of professionalism and capabilities that are, bar none, I would say above and beyond any person that's going to get a civilian trained pilot license. And it comes down to the structure. A lot of that is based off of, and I've had conversations with CFIs about this. I've seen, and again, in my opinion, the CFI side of the house on the general aviation is very much how many students can we put through, how fast can we get them. It's money, it's hours for the instructor. The military is not that way. It's you show up, you brief, you fly, you screw a lot of things up, and then you sit down at ground speed 0 and your instructor yells at you and tells you that you're stupid, but then he tells you how to fix it. And you learn so much more in a debrief scenario, and those debriefs could be hours long, could be twice or 3 times longer than your flight, going through all the things that you did wrong. So that when you wake up to fly the next morning, you go, okay, now I can fix those things and I can get better every day and a lot faster. So there's really a structured environment from the military training perspective, I think. That is better than going through the civilian.
And you build a thick skin because of that, and I find that military pilots do have a thicker skin than some of the civilian pilots because we did do that debrief, and that's how you become a better pilot, and you sucked and you need to fix it. And so you go, yes sir, and then you move on instead of being all, oh, he said mean things about me. So I really appreciated the training that I received. You learn how to compartmentalize, and you learn that discipline and structure, and how to just move on.
Yeah, I will tell you, it's a funny story, and you're not going to see this on the general aviation side of the world. I went through training, and at some point in time I had a break in my training, and then I went back to flying. It was just the way the schedule worked out, and so it was like there were a few weeks in between, and my first flight back was bad. I'd not been in an airplane for quite a while. From the time the airplane touched down and we were taxiing back, I can't count how many times the instructor told me I was stupid. To the point where I got out of the airplane, and as I'm getting out, I'm unbuckling from my parachute and opening the canopy, and he's like, "You're the dumbest person I've ever met. You are so stupid." And he tells me I'm stupid all the way to the building. And I'm pretty sure he told me I was stupid in the debrief. That to be said, it was like Charlotte said, it was a thick-skinned building scenario. I got pretty down on myself sitting in the debrief, and then the instructor looks up and he goes, Lieutenant Jackson, I've seen your records and I know you're a good aviator, so you're going to move on to your next flight. Just don't screw that up again. But he walked me through all the things that I did wrong before that. Did he need to call me stupid? No. Did I care that he called me stupid? At the time, yes. But now that I look back, I don't really care. It's actually kind of a funny story. And that's not to scare any guys out there who want to join the military. It's not a constant berating of being called stupid or being called dumb or high praise all the time and pats on the back or anything. It's not the wild left and right limits of what you see in the movies by any means. But there are scenarios in training that sometimes you just feel terrible afterwards.
And it's not to say that the CFI, we don't want to downplay the CFI because, my God, the CFI has to know so much. I mean, beyond imaginable. I actually looked at it at one point. I was like, I might kind of, oh no, that's way too much to know.
And he's got a kid trying to kill him.
Mad respect to the CFI, so we don't want to downplay that. But there is something to be said about maybe a little bit of the roughness that the military deals out.
Yeah.
So in regards to if your focus is to become a civilian aviator, regionals or major airline type thing, it's a good question. Do I go military or do I just straight up go civilian route? And there are pros and cons to both. The military, if you get a pilot training slot from the military, you owe them 10 years. So automatically you are not going to be able to become a civilian major airline pilot for 10.
That 10 years starts after you graduate.
After you get your wings,
training,
which takes a year.
Up to a year, sometimes a little longer.
A little longer, depending.
So you may be in 12 years before you're
Good
out.
point. Very good point.
Just something to keep in mind.
So the great thing, though, with becoming a military pilot, like we talked about just a minute ago, is the discipline that you're going to receive as an aviator in the military, the experience. Most of the time, it's going to be a worldwide type experience. You're going to get the chance to fly in Europe, in Southwest Asia, possibly deployed, possibly in combat. That is going to add to all of your experiences as an aviator and make you a better pilot. So there's that, which is fantastic. However, it's going to take you 10 years, whereas if you go the civilian regional route, you're able to get your CFI, then either teach or pick up your hours doing aerial survey or any other type of building block, get to the regionals, get to the majors, and you're going to be able to get to the majors in your 20s possibly.
In your 20s, yeah.
Assuming that things like pandemics don't affect you. So there's that to consider. But I mean, that's my pros and cons.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It really becomes a how fast do you want to do it? Yeah. And as long as there's no hurdles in the way and you can get to your ATP minimums relatively quickly via CFI work or any low time pilot jobs where you can build hours quickly, going straight to the regionals is probably the right way to do it if you want to spend a long career in a major airline. I would argue personally that to each their own, but if you do 10 years in the military, if you do even more than that, 15 to 20 years, I think the experiences that you gain during that time before you go to the regionals or even to the majors, for me, far outweigh just being a major airline pilot. Now, you can still see the world as a major airline pilot, but I think the experiences are going to be vastly different. And again, the camaraderie, the friendships that you're going to build in the military also outweigh rushing right into the airlines. Not by no means is this a recruiting video to rush right out and join the military and become an aviator, but that's kind of how I look at it. But I have the ability to have 20 years of hindsight to say, would I have done this any differently? And my answer is no, I would not have done this any differently. The military was for me the right decision, and I would not change that by any means. Start out as a navigator, become a commercial pilot afterwards, and start building times to try to move on to something else. Absolutely would do it no differently.
But to control your path, if you absolutely want to be the aviator, you can't necessarily control that by going into the military. So
No.
if you are absolutely positively wanting to be that pilot, then I think the regional path is that I flew for SkyWest for almost 2 years. Absolutely loved flying in the regionals. Learned everything about Part 121 world. It was fantastic, and flew with some really great people and learned a lot too. So I think the regionals and then moving on to the majors is a great way to go, especially if that's 100% what you want to do.
So, favorite flying stories, things that we'd like to like to talk about. I have a few. But the first one I'll say is more of a fun story, and it's kind of a there I was, and it actually worked out really well for us. We were at Red Flag, which, if you're unfamiliar with what Red Flag is, the Air Force will hold major air war exercises several times a year. And what we do is a lot of aircraft, fighters, bombers, tankers, AWACS, J-Stars, C-130, C-17s. It's basically every airplane in the inventory of some variant will show up at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. And it's a 2-week exercise where the aircraft go up in the air, they go into a MOA, and they basically have a small-scale war. And this one Red Flag, we were out flying our mission, which is to go from the east to the west of the range, and we're supposed to drop some bombs on our targets, and then we're supposed to egress, which is, we're gonna run out of the area because conveniently the way they set up the airspace, your targets are where the enemy, we call red air, can regenerate. So they go back after they've been killed, they go past a certain lat long line, they become healthy again, and then they can come back and shoot you down. But the targets happen to be in the same area. So we're flying B-1s, we make it all the way to the target area, we drop our weapons, we kill the targets, we turn off target, and lo and behold, we hear a regenerated jet get allowed to re-enter the war. And I realize that regen jet is rolling in on the back of the B-1. So I tell the pilots that we need to speed up and just fly straight ahead. And what we're doing now, we're flying from west to east. And the way the airspace is designed, there's a certain part of the airspace that we're not allowed to fly into. It's just a restricted area. And we're hauling the mail at supersonic at this point, going straight for this thing. But we're trying to outrun the F-16 that has rolled in on our 6. And he's trying to creep in close enough where he can get either a heater shot on us, so he's trying to do pick up on our IR and take a shot, or he's trying to do a gun run, but he's trying to get closer to us so that he can kill a bomber. But we're now doing supersonic, he's doing supersonic. We're running him out of gas, which is a good thing, but now we're both just blasting towards this part of the airspace that we're not allowed into. I'm using the radar on the B-1 to figure out what's out in front of us, and I happen to pick up off to our about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, there's a small cell, thunder cell that had developed. And I decided I was going to use that to my advantage. So just as we're screaming towards the airspace that we're not supposed to be into, the controllers are yelling at us that we need to work north immediately, turn left immediately, and my pilot is asking me, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And I keep saying, just keep flying straight. I got this. And just as we pass this thundercloud, I call for a brake turn to the north. The B-1 rolls. We've got our wings are pinned at 67.5 degrees, doing supersonic. We roll into a turn. We turn 90 degrees to the north. The F-16 does the same thing, and immediately he sees that thunderstorm, and he has to break off, and we go behind the thunderstorm. And then we roll out north of the restricted area, and we go home. That to me was the greatest day of flying, because I was able to work out a solution at Mach speed to be able to figure out what the turn radius needed to be to start the turn, to be able to get behind the thunderstorm and get in front of the restricted area to outrun a guy who was going to shoot us down. So that was a fun story. If you want to take over and jump in on one of your fun ones.
I would like to challenge you to tell that story without using your hands.
Impossible. Impossible. You have to shoot the watch down. Always shooting the watch.
Shooting the watch, baby. You bomber guys.
Yeah, eh?
Lord. Well, I don't have any, well, Lord knows.
You want me to do it for
we
you?
We don't go supersonic in the C-130. I actually have a picture of myself at flight level 310. It's the absolute highest I've ever been in the C-130. It was a very proud day. And even the controller, as we were coming back from Afghanistan, is like, you guys a C-130? We're like, yes, we are. He's like, how does it feel being up at 310? I'm like, pretty damn good. So I was very proud. But one of the stories that I really or one of the times I really enjoyed flying the C-9. So while I was stationed in Germany at Ramstein Air Base, I flew the C-9 for air medical evacuation. And we flew all over the European theater as well as Southwest Asia, and we picked up patients everywhere, and we brought them back to Landstuhl, which was the best medical facility in Germany, or actually in the entire theater. And we had an alert mission, so we would sit Bravo and Alpha alerts, so that would give you a 3-hour or 1-hour response time to get into the aircraft and take off. And we had to fly down to Italy and pick up a man who had been in a motorcycle accident, and he was not wearing his helmet, and they had to remove a portion of his cranium, his skull, to allow the brain to swell because he had such traumatic injury to his brain, and so they needed to get him back to Germany as fast as possible. But as you know, with geography, in between Germany and Italy, there's a large mountain range called the Alps, and that causes issues when you're trying to keep the swelling of the brain. So it was actually a pretty challenging mission. We had to work with the French as well, all the different kind of ATCs, because we had to find a special route through the Alps that would allow us to stay, I forget the altitudes, but we were given very specific guidance from the medical team, the critical care action team, the CCAT, we were only allowed to have so much pressure on the brain or pressure differential within the airplane itself to make sure that the patient stayed safe. And so that's what we did.
You can tell a story.
Yeah. So another one of my favorite stories that I tell, it's not necessarily a good story, but the outcome of it was good, and it really boiled down to crew coordination, the ability to work together, having the trust and faith of the people that are in the airplane and sitting right beside you throughout the entire thing. And it really was a series of events that occurred over a long, long night. But at the end of the night, we came back safely. So we're deployed to Southwest Asia in a location, flying the B-1s into Afghanistan. And this particular night, I'm with a relatively new crew from what I normally fly with. But we get in the airplane. We've all had the same training, so that's the most important part. But we get in the airplane, we start the engines, everything's fine with the airplane. We taxi out to the runway. And in the B-1, the requirement for any takeoff is to go full afterburner. No matter how heavy or light you are, it's a full afterburner takeoff. And a full afterburner takeoff with a B-1 uses a lot of fuel. Astronomical amounts of pounds per hour are burned. But the burn from the fuel is coming from the main fuel tanks directly in the engines, while the other tanks in the airplane feed the mains. So just as we rotate, we get off the ground, the pilot calls for the gear, co-pilot raises the gear, and then immediately says the main fuel tanks are not filling, because he's got a gauge in front of him and he's watched them, and the mains have drained down to very low amounts, almost to the minimum amount that we needed. And the pilot says, well, run the checklist. Co-pilot says, I've already run it. He goes, we'll run it again. Co-pilot says, I've run it twice. I've recycled the fuel. I've done everything I'm supposed to do. It's not working. And the pilot goes, oh, then we need to return immediately. So we level off. We're at about 5,000 feet. We wind out getting over the ocean of where we are, and we make a turn back, and we declare an emergency. And the decision from the crew at that point was, what are we going to have to do to get this B-1 on the ground safely? So we started out, we're about 440,000 pounds on the airplane. The max landing weight of the B-1 is 350,000 pounds. So at this point, we're already 90,000 pounds overweight. But we're going to get fuel off the airplane by dumping out the wing tanks. So over the country that we're at 5,000 feet, emergency that we are, the pilot goes fuel dump. And so we start dumping all the jet fuel as much as we can get out of the airplane as fast as possible. The next option was going to be to jettison all of our weapons. We had 24 2,000-pound weapons on board at the time, so we had 48,000 pounds of weapons that we could have just jettisoned into the desert. We elected not to do that because, well, the political implications of a lot of inert bombs in a country that's not yours probably was not going to go well, so we elected to hold on to those. But we were able to get the airplane down to 350,000 pounds, or I'm sorry, 400,000 pounds, so 50,000 pounds above the limit. But the next thing was to try to figure out what the landing speed is. And the pilot says, what is landing speed for 400,000 pounds? And the co-pilot says, well, there's not one. The charts only go to 350. And he goes, I need a landing speed for 400,000. He goes, there's not one. He goes, I need a landing speed for 400,000. You can tell the pilot is working hard to figure out how he's going to land the airplane because it's never been done. A B-1's never been landed this heavy before. Luckily, we have over 13,000 feet of runway that we can use, but it's hot out there. Luckily, it wasn't high or humid, but we're heavy, so it's hot and heavy. So we're going to use a lot of runway. So there's some rules of thumbs that they teach you as you're going through the training. So I use the rule of thumb very quickly and say, the approach speed at 400,000 is 200 knots. So we're doing 200 knots on final. Gear down, flaps as far as we could get them at 200 knots. And when we roll out on final, we have an AOA indicator, which basically has just chevrons and the green donut in the middle is what we call it, the green donut. Angle of attack. And the pilot rolls out, and the angle of attack goes to green donut at 202 knots. And he goes, approach speed is 202 knots. And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty awesome. So I'm looking at my fellow Wizzo, because I'm the instructor in the back seat. I'm like, I'm the greatest guy that's ever been in this airplane. You know, hey, look at me. The next thing I realize is, well, we still have to stop this airplane, and we may not be able to stop it. So we may wind up in the desert at some point in time because the airplane can't stop. So I start putting all my equipment on and getting ready to eject if we needed to. So I'm trying to tell my fellow Wizzo the same thing. And I think still thinks I'm over there cheering as I'm putting helmets on and gloves on and strapping everything down so I don't get burned from the ejection seat and everything. But he catches on and realizes he should do the same thing. In a panic, he starts making sure that he's ready to go. The pilot lands, basically brick one, slightly firm to dissipate the landing speed. And we roll out and use the entire runway. I think it was 13,500 foot runway where we were. And we used the entire runway to stop. And we turned off on the last taxiway, stopped there, started to shut the airplane down. We were on a very high priority mission for the night. So we had an individual come to the airplane and immediately say, my call sign is Tito. He goes, Tito, what's your game plan? And I said, sir, we're going to get out of this airplane and we're going to go get in that airplane and we're going to go fly our mission. He said, that's all I wanted to hear. So we get out of that airplane and we go and change airplanes. The night continues to go on. We take off in the new airplane. We get to Afghanistan. The mission set that we were tasked to support was in northeast Afghanistan. And geographically, if you look at a map of Afghanistan, that is what's called the Hindu Kush mountain range, which is the beginning of the Himalayas, which have mountains that are,
very tall.
They should probably come up with another word besides mountain for those things. They're massive. They're beyond big. So now we're up in this area and we're supporting an army convoy who's moving through the mountains. It's night. The pilots are on night vision goggles. The convoy's driving around with what we call blackout lights, which basically they put these covers on the headlights, have little slits, so they just a minimal amount of light through because the drivers of the convoys are on night vision goggles also, and they're just following each other in trail going through the mountains. So we decided that for us to be able to escort this, we got to get a little bit closer so the pilots can keep their eyes on them. So we're going to descend into the mountain area to figure out where we're going to go. Lo and behold, one of my jobs as a navigator to look at the maps, figure out what the terrain is, how low can we go, brief that to the pilots, tell them, hey, based off of what I see, the minimum safe altitude for this flight is, in this case, 10,000 feet. I briefed that, and everybody says, Roger, got it. Unfortunately, what we didn't do, and this goes back to the uh-oh moment, is the co-pilot said, well, I'm going to put my helmet on. So he took his headset off, and I started looking closer because we had Falcon View is what program that we had. A lot of people are familiar with ForeFlight now, similar. It's kind of the early editions of that. So I'm able to zoom in closer, and I realized that we could probably get down to about 8,000 feet instead of 10. We could actually get closer because it's in a valley. And I say, well, the new minimum safe altitude is 8,000 feet.
Yep.
3 people hear it. The co-pilot never hears it. He puts his helmet on and goes, co-pilot's back up on his helmet. And everybody goes, okay. But nobody says, hey, co-pilot, the altitude's 8,000 feet. So we start our descent. We're descending through 20,000 or so feet, trying to get down to 10 and then lower. And the standard call-outs that we're used to saying is 2,000 to level off, 1,000 feet to level off, then level off. That way it's the crew coordination. Everybody knows exactly what's going on. Well, we reach 12,000 feet and no one says anything. But it's my job first as the navigator to say 2,000, but I didn't say anything. So the co-pilot immediately does what he's supposed to do and say 2,000 feet, level off. And that's when it dawned on the crew, oh yeah, we didn't tell him that. So, no, co-pilot, it's actually 8,000 feet. Sorry for the confusion. And he's like, okay, I got it. Are you guys sure? Like, I'm 100% sure. I've looked it up. We're good here. So we continue our descent. We get to 10,000. I call 2,000 to level off. But no one says anything. And then we get to 9,000 feet. And I say 1,000 feet to level off. And no one says anything. And then we're approaching 8,000 feet, and we're in a turn. The pilot flying is looking at the convoy. He's called eyes on the convoy. He's looking at it. We hit 8,000 feet, and I say level off. And the airplane's not leveling off. It's continuing a descent and a turn. And I say level off again. And then I say level off again. And the co-pilot, who is now so frazzled from the first emergency, from where we landed so heavy, and had to do all the procedures to be able to get on the ground for that, does one of the right steps, and I'll get into what he could have done better, but it's funny now that we say it. He screams the words, pull up GD, as loud as he possibly can. And the pilot rolls wings level, pulls the nose as high as he can get it, and goes full afterburner in the B-1. So some Army convoy in the middle of the Hindu Kush gets this light show of 4 afterburners climbing out over the top of them, making a heck of a racket, hopefully scaring all the enemy away. But we finally level off, and the pilot admittedly said he was having such a difficult time seeing the convoy on NVGs that that's the only thing he could focus on. That he couldn't even hear us telling him the altitudes because he was, the term we call in the Air Force is called padlocked. He had a soda straw on what he was doing. And luckily, again, because there's 3 other individuals in the airplane that all are doing backup jobs for each other as far as altitude call-outs, navigation, making sure that we're not hitting terrain, that we didn't impact the mountains that night. Needless to say, the rest of the night, it was very quiet in the cockpit. Not a lot of conversation occurred. Everybody realized how close to a really bad night they had. And when we finally got on the ground, again, it goes back to that camaraderie. The pilot looked at all of us and said, I wouldn't have blamed you guys if you would have ejected and never said anything to me. If you would have pulled the handles and left.
I'm out.
But I certainly appreciate the fact that you stayed with me. So I take that story. It was terrifying at the time, but it's one of those stories that, again, it's an experience you take forward in the rest of your flying career, especially if you're flying in a cockpit with more than one person on that crew resource management or cockpit resource management, whatever you want to call it, CRM these days, on being able to have that communication flow either 2 ways or 4 ways, depending who was on the airplane, and making sure that everyone is on the same page at all times. And if they're not, get them on the same page.
Okay. So my advice for any, a pilot aspiring to move up in the ranks, whether that be from, private pilot up to commercial or whatnot, one of the first things is networking. And that starts with, and this seems super simple and basic, but you should have a business card. It should be a simple business card with your name, your email, your phone number, and maybe a LinkedIn account, but that's it. And have that on you at all times. You never know who you're going to meet in the parking lot while getting your hair cut, or, on the elevator at some point in time. So Monahan Airport. There you go. Exactly. You never know who you're going to meet. So be ready to give that person your card and network. And And along that same lines, because so much, especially in the private and the corporate business world type area, it is a lot of word of mouth. You don't get to just Google a job search and find that job. The networking is critical and crucial, but that Facebook page that you've got, it's got to be professional. So I have 2 Facebook pages. I have my friends and family one, and then I have the one that I will give out to my coworkers, or if asked if I'm on social media, that's the one I use, and that's the appropriate one. So not to say that I have 2 different lives, it's just one is my dysfunctional friends and family, and one is my more professional page. But those are the 2 pieces of advice I have, and just stay focused and enjoy what you do. If you don't love it, then don't chase it. Because in this world in aviation, you have to love it. You have to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, to add on to that, my biggest piece of advice is always be a humble pilot.
Oh, good one.
At no point in time are you going to know everything there is to know about aviation. I've been flying in a career now with the Air Force and the commercial pilot and stuff like this over 20 years. Charlotte's been flying over 20 years. And every time I fly, I learn something that I probably should have already known. Every time. So stay humble. Always realize that no matter how young the person to your right is, if they're a first officer,
or to your left.
Or to your left.
Who are younger than me.
Yep. Or if they're just another crew member, a navigator or a combat systems officer in the Air Force or anything, they're still a wealth of knowledge that you can learn from. So don't be the person who walks into the cockpit knowing everything and no one can tell you anything differently. That's my biggest piece of advice. Then my next piece of advice is take care of yourself. Stay healthy, exercise, take care of your eyes and your ears. Because at some point in time, we all hit those flight physicals where you're skirting that edge
you're
of
old like us.
Yeah, you're always skirting that edge of, ooh, am I going to make my first class physical this year?
Yeah.
So take care of yourself and everything else. Like Charlotte said, stay with the grind. If you enjoy it, things will fall in place. It just takes time.
It's good. No one said I had this much fun with you. They all told me about the hard times, but they said nothing about the miracles. Look, it's all good.